Well, let's reorganize the desk a little bit. So, there's like all those topics about quality and releases and quality projects going on. And, people are confused about what exactly this means. For different people, it might mean different things. Let's have some moment and try to figure out what it's all about and try, to put everybody on the same page about what is expected, what can be done, and where still some stuff can be improved even further. Okay, so one thing which became quite apparent for some people is we need to kind of come back to the roots of what Blender is, and Blender is for artists. It's not only about code, although having clean code and whatnot does help, but it's more like a tool than the goal in itself. That being said, that feature creep also doesn't really help Blender because there is only that many features per unit software we can have that actually helps people. So other things to remember is Blender is a team project. Like we are a big team. We are working together on this piece of software. We are like, I don't know, 40, whatever, maybe more people and technical artists working on it as part of Blender. We have Blender Studio, which on the one hand does beautiful movies, but then it's also supposed to be participating in all those designs and testing and whatnot. And another aspect is we have community, and in some cases it feels like, okay, so community kind of gets a bit like scattered and whatnot, and we can benefit from it a bit more, but it's not really what this talk is about. So within this big team, the big aspect, the communication between people, and it is important like to understand like what we're talking about, things like that. For developers, code is a communication. That's why developers might be so passionate about code, like maybe partially because they just love the craft of coding, but eventually they realize, well, they're talking code, not like English. It's more like, okay, so what do you think? And I just send a snippet of the code instead of trying to explain it on a plain English. Other aspect which I'm not sure, like worth reiterating is that developers do read code much more than they type it, which has like all sorts of implications. Like, okay, so saving time on typing code is not very efficient investment of time, because later on you'll be like, I wish I explained it much better back in the days when I had chance, but the time is gone and you wouldn't remember why you did things the way they were done. And the other important thing is the documentation of whatever work you're doing, and which includes documentation of pull requests or projects or the code or whatever patches you're working on, or some architectural documentation. It all adds up to the way to communicate between developers, between different groups of developers, because like Blender is so, it consists of so many different parts, so people might be like a bit further away in the terms of being on the same page when they use terminology and whatnot. And documentation somehow brings everybody together and also helps like bringing new developers on board. So what happens in Blender? So it's a bit complicated topic, and for some things we have some answers, some others they are changing and we don't have answer yet. So we have module work, and modules expected to work on designs and roadmaps within the module, where the module itself want to go. Module implement certain things within the module, like they at least have they have the freedom for that and empowerment, maybe not necessarily the time for it, but in terms of tools what they have, that's what they can be spending time on. And currently the maintenance, which involves bug fixing and solving some technical debts, is what's supposed to be happening in the module. And also it's up to the modules to ensure their module is well documented. We also have the projects, where the project is more about like bringing new exciting features to Blender, like working with the number of people within a team on a project. And for the project we expect to happening design and documentation of what's happening in the project, implementation of the project. Something way less defined is the stabilization of the project and handing the state of the project to the modules, saying, okay, so the project is done, active phase of development is finished, it's in a good state, now it just becomes something that a module is taking care of. And another thing which feels the least developed is the follow-ups on the project. It's quite often where we do the project, we implement it, we gather some initial feedback, and we release project, and we say, well, let's now move to something else, while people actually start using things, and maybe some follow-up is needed. I think presentation go a bit more into details in a bit. So for the documentation, we have different levels of documentation, and it happens in different places. For the sake of code, the architectural documentation is like, well, it's basically different levels. So we need to have architectural documentation, algorithms, the API, and the code itself to make code explanatory. This is something we have all the tools we need, I believe, and kind of supposed to be happening. How to empower it more, it's like, that's a different question. So before we get into more details about like all those topics and what's expected, what can be done better, and things like that. So stability. So Blender, we did number of releases this year. Blender 4.2. Well, I mean, I don't know, like, it wasn't the worst release, but some lessons to be learned from it. And suffice to say that a lot of experimental and not so polished features went into LTS release, with all sorts of implications of that for both people for studios who want to stick to LTS releases, and also for our team to maintain the state of 4.2 for the next 2 years. And then there is 4.3. So that's a lot of things happening for 4.3. So first of all, some misjudgment of whatever planning happened. We had to postpone the release by 1 week because of the amount of high priority issues which we wanted to tackle for the release. And that's already, like, those number of bugs was already accounting for the technically regression, which they cannot happen for 4.3. In theory, we should have postponed it by 1 more week to fully follow the release candidate schedule, where basically every time you make a change to a software, you state on a release candidate. You only go from release candidate to release when there is no changes done. So the difference should be just one string somewhere saying, okay, so now it's a release. So a couple of weeks before the release, we had 50 high priority reports. Well, 2 weeks before the actual release, so which means 1 week before the planned release. That's why we postponed it. The day of the release, we probably had 20 of high severity, should I say, which is an improvement, and a lot of those reports are not necessarily related to 4.3 for the release itself. It's just the overall number of high severity reports. So we made the release, and then, this Monday, we checked the status, and there are 59 high severity reports, which, we kind of anticipated, but I hope it will be less, and then it's also kind of, shows you how exactly things went. And that doesn't even account for the bug reports which are not marked as high severity. And for the past 2 weeks, it also was this feeling that people don't have throughputs to keep track of non-high severity reports. Release itself was also not very walk in the park. There were a couple of last-minute changes, which resulted in the release happening much later, mainly us waiting for the build to be finished. Some of the changes had some unforeseen consequences on the build times, and within the mess of the past week before the release, there was no clear follow-up for it, and it kind of slipped through the cracks, whatnot. BPY module, BPY module is in the PIP package for BPY, which we share on the PyP store. That kind of slipped through the crack initially, and then we started releasing it, and we couldn't because of various reasons. Whatever crossed the quota on the size, whatnot. And last but not least, there is the Windows on ARM, which also had all sorts of issues. The BPY module on Windows on ARM does not pass regression tests, and we didn't know that on a Microsoft App Store you can have different architecture for the same app, so that also didn't happen for initial release. So there was that. So why did we end up there? So the projects landing to main branch. There were quite some projects landing quite late in the release cycle of Blender, and some of those projects were landing in the non-feature complete state, which for some of the projects that was a bit hard decision to make, but overall for team spirit, that's what we wanted to do, to just give a bit more of this final stretch for a couple of big projects. And I mean, it did have effect on the stability, but like overall, it probably was not a bad choice. But basically, we probably shouldn't do it again. Projects keeps adding technical depth to the modules, and that happens with many projects happening in the past. It's like a lot of stuff being done. Like, okay, so we don't solve it as a part of the as a project module. We'll need to take care of that. You multiply that by the number of projects which are happening, and then see how many people in the Blender project, and math kind of doesn't add up. And other thing is the follow-ups. We usually try to collect feedback early on in the project, but it always have this limited scope of how deep the feedback can be, just because the amount of people testing project is limited, and the versatility is also quite limited, and the only real time when project starts being tested is after release. And we never schedule any official follow-up on it, not and can rely again on the module to tackle certain topics, which again adds load to the module. The state of the main branch. Okay, so one thing, again, coming back to the roots of how Blender was developed years ago and how we started with Blender, is main branch. Back then it was called trunk, then it went to the master branch, now it's main branch. It should be considered stable. There is very good reason for that. There are many good reasons for that. The main being, it's like, okay, in order to do quality call for feedback of ongoing projects, it should be easy for people to use Blender. If people cannot launch Blender because some whatever bug lingering around, that does have effect on people giving feedback on ongoing projects. And another big topic which people seems to have strong opinions online about the Blender Studio using the main branch. There is this topic. It's like, hey, why, if they want stability, why not to use LTS? Well, the good reason is that we rely on the studio to give to participate closely in the design discussions. If we say, well, if studio wants stability and they are locked in LTS, that has effect on their ability to give quality feedback on designs. And other aspect is like, okay, it shouldn't be that hard to keep main branch stable. But like what causes them? Like a lot of refactors are happening, like because people want clean code, whatnot. A lot of regression caused by the refactors, and that all has like all sorts of other implications. Like, okay, so main branch might be less stable, but then triaging team will probably need to spend time on bisecting and whatnot when regression happens. There's extra load to the module who maintains that piece of code. So there are implications to making those type of refactors. High severity reports open for months. Like recently, I think, I'm not sure if it's already officially closed or not. The report, it was at the Blender conference, it was 1 year anniversary of high severity report, which is like, why? And other aspect which also affects a lot of developers is the state of the tests. They might fail at random. The failure is ignored for quite a long time. The GPU tests, I forgot when I saw them being green last time, which has like all sorts of implications of like, okay, so developers cannot really trust the tests. So they see red and they have this assumption, okay, so some test is not reliable, so we can just ignore this red. In the past weeks, there were a few cases where it should not have been ignored, and that was actual bug in the PRs, and people just, considering, well, it's something intermittent. Well, that caused regression in the main branch. So when it comes to communication, what can we do? So to be clear, it's like, okay, so this is like more like outline. Okay, so what is this, the most common topics when it comes, to the sources of struggle? Okay, so what can be done, and what we expect from the team to pay attention to. So for the communication, we always say, well, we need a design before you start code. What is a good design? And I mean, that's a very good question. And I mean, there were some attempts to clarify it on the documentation, but I don't know, to me personally, that was a lot of text, and be like, but in a lame terms, what does it mean? Like for someone who, who wants to learn, okay, so what is expected, or for someone new to the community, what is the gist of it? Like, I just have limited time as a volunteer, or like whatever, what do you expect? So ideally we would have something like ingredients of a patch, which we already have in the documentation. It consists of, set of points which we expect, and it should be quite terse. Like, more information is not necessarily better in some cases. But the important parts of the design is a scope and a goal which this design addresses. And important thing is to remember that it needs to be presented from user perspective. It shouldn't be like, okay, so there is this code change, this is design of this code change. That makes quite hard to review and find the proper solution to the problem, because you can see, okay, so this is code seems, unideal, but maybe it's the best way for achieving the goal. So, and it's important to see like, okay, so what the goal is. So maybe it's just maybe it's inevitable to go that route with the code, or maybe there is some other approach reaching the same goal which doesn't involve stressing the code and architecture too much. Other thing which is important is to look at the problem which design is solving from a Bob's perspective. Like, who is a Bob? Well, Bob is imaginary personality, which is not you. It could be, it's important to remember, okay, so you're presenting something to others. So how is it clear for others of what the problem is about? What is it trying to solve? Other aspect is like, if it's some design of some usability level, it's like, okay, so everybody has their own ways of working with and communicating with the software, and something that is obvious for you might not be so obvious for others. It's something quite hard to do, to anticipate how others people try to use the system or the tool you're designing to, but it's something like we need to learn to do better. Other aspect is like, okay, so you're spending all this time solving finding a solution to the problem you're trying to solve. Okay, so but what are the other solutions you already looked into, and is the current proposal solves all the issues? Because like commonly it will be asked in the review of the design, and it will just, if it's not written up front, then it just delays the reviews. If people say, okay, so I spent this time, there are like 5 different approaches, look into them, they don't seem to be good, this is why, that saves time to review the designs. So there is that. So for the bug reports, there is a lot of bug reports in the tracker which don't have activity. And why is it so? So maybe sometimes people are looking into it and it's something much bigger than just a bug and it needs time to work on. Maybe it's being actively worked on, or maybe just forgotten. Having clear state of the bug in the report is important, especially if it's high priority. Something which we started doing from Cycles module is to have this big note at the top of the high severity report, which is like, well, mainly for the high severity reports which are there for a long time, because sometimes it might be some architectural change we need to do. Sometimes it's caused by external factors like drivers, and we want to be able to communicate that, okay, so people who are responsible for whatever that platform, this is what we want to work with, that's what we want you to work on, and this is why it's high severity. But for people who keep track on the state of Blender, being able to click on the report, see that, hey, this is actually being worked on, it's easy. They click on the report, see it immediately, they close, not a problem. Less than ideal, but it works better than trying to rely on the fact that some information somewhere down in the comments and you need to spend time on reading through all the comments for all these high severity reports we have. And other aspect for the bug reports is basically when the status changes, it needs to be clear why. Sometimes bug reports being closed, and it's like, why is it closed? Is it fixed? Is it not a bug? Like, what is it? Or sometimes severity is being changed in any direction. It's like, okay, so when severity changes to the whatever high severity, it's like, why? It's like, okay, so what was the decision behind it? Or when it lowers down, it's like also, okay, so why is it so? And similar thing also applies to the PRs, like having clear state of the PRs, whether they're being closed, or is there actually some feedback still needs to be resolved or whatnot. Making clear in the comment, okay, so it looks good, like can be landed. Or when we just request changes, like, okay, so what is this actionable part for the PR to change? For the state of the module and the projects, we have this technology called forkboards. We embrace it more and more, which is great. Sometimes maintenance of the workboard kind of slips through the cracks, partially. Well, at least from my perspective, because technically to keep track of like whatever 3-4 workboards. I'm not sure. Maybe it's better for other projects and modules, but basically maintaining the workboard is important to see, okay, what's going on, what's being prioritized, where things needs to be happening. And other thing is, while having a workboard is a good way to present the state of the module of the project and make it clear for people. It's like, okay, so that's where we can be starting with the water modular project. Having a parent task for any big-ish project with a checklist is super useful. First of all, it makes it clear for people who oversee the entirety state of Blender or Blender release and whatnot to see, okay, so what the state of this project, what needs to be done. But also it's a tool for yourself to remember what still needs to be done for that project, because you cannot always rely on remembering everything. And having like a checkbox which reminds you what you wanted to spend time, maybe before you consider the project done, or maybe just some discovery. It's like, okay, so ideally we need to refactor something, and then just write it down, and then it doesn't get lost that easily. I mean, for the examples, it's like we try to do our best with the Cycles workboard, and like one of the examples for the project is the light linking, where we also try to be more clear. It's like, okay, so there are like, the essentials topics for the light linking and something good to have for longer term. So for the light linking to finish, all of this needs to be checked out for light linking being useful and shippable. It's only a small portion of the task which we need to tackle. Well, let's talk about documentation. So one important thing is like, more you put in the comments and documentation, future you will love you for that. It's if you'll stick with the project for long enough, you'll be seeing like cases like, why this code is written this weirdly? Who even wrote it? And then you go back, and it's like, oh, that was me. But why? So documenting why things are happening in the code and what was design decisions behind it, that's going to help you. So if that's not enough motivational, it also helps other developers to get up to speed in whatever projects on a module you're working on. It's quite often where, like, we see, hey, we need to start this new project, and then people say, well, I need to get familiar with the area. And how to get familiar? Well, maybe like do some refactors to see what code is doing, things like that. It's like, that's not unfair, but then it's like, well, but is there documentation explains why things are done the way they're done? Well, unfortunately, no. And then people need to dig, spend their time, understand the area, and maybe make some wrong decisions about if some refactors is correct or not. So, and it's also for people who are new to Blender, having documentation will help understanding what's going on, especially for the architectural documentation, which, fast forwarding a bit, it's like more about like what are the moving parts and what the interaction between bigger parts, which are not so obvious from just reading the code. So for documentation, we have few levels, right? So for the architectural part, as I mentioned, it basically defines, okay, so what are the biggest part of Blender, how they interact with each other. For example, like, okay, so there is a compositor, there is like whatever cycles, okay, so they interact with whatever render pipeline or whatever. Something that is not changing that often and hence doesn't become a burden to maintain. And it's supposed to be living in the weird place on the docs called features, but I'm not sure why that folder was called features, but that's where architectural documentation for cycles and many other things are. So URL is a bit misleading, but it is what it is. An example could be, it's like, okay, so what is this wavefront render in cycles is, in which order kernels are executed, and what is the flow of this wavefront from one kernel to another. It's something you cannot really visualize in the code, at least in a readable manner, and in a readable manner and in a discoverable manner, because finding documentation in the code also has its own challenges. If it's something about architectural things, it's like, okay, which part of the file are you looking into to find that specific architecture? Other thing which is a bit more vague and we don't spend as much time as we should is description of algorithms. Because architecture is like one thing, and it's quite clear, it's like, okay, so it lives in this whatever documentation website describes things it describes. Okay, algorithms, for some of things which just, handbook Q-sort implementations, like, okay, who cares? The thing is, we have something much more sophisticated from the algorithmic designs, and sometimes it might not be that obvious that, like, okay, for this algorithm to work, there are actually pieces and multiple parts of Blender. And again, it's something where it becomes quite difficult to see where is the description of this algorithm. Like, you might be looking at the code, it's like, I don't really understand it. Where is it? Where they look for the something else, for description of what's going on there. And other aspect for putting the algorithmical documentation outside of the code is that we can put pictures and diagrams. It's like beautiful, and nobody likes to read, everybody likes to watch pretty pictures. And other aspect is of putting those algorithms somewhere else is like I believe a lot of them can be published as papers. Maybe not like this groundbreaking research, but there's also places where you see like, okay, so there's this groundbreaking whatever algorithm for rendering, which doesn't actually work for the production render, but this is how we implemented it in cycles, and also the changes we needed to do, for example, or for the motion tracking, and having the knowledge of how to apply those groundbreaking algorithms in something production, I believe there is market for it, and it's not something that exists in the quantities it should be online. An example of all this could be light and shadow linking, where we lack a bit of diagrams and pretty pictures, but at least it shows that, okay, so this is how the wavefront of cycles rendering is affected by this light and shadow linking, and why is it so. And on implementation details, all those changes are kind of scattered all over the code, just because the way how wavefront renderers work. For the code, I mean, everybody knows the code, so there is like API documentation, local readability, and all sorts of things. I'll come back to it later in the presentation. We're talking about code. Projects. Let's talk about projects. So when project starts, I would say that before project can start, it needs to have a goal. Like, okay, so what it is, where this project goes to, and be concrete, like saying, hey, let's look about groundbreaking rendering technologies. Well, that's not really a project. Let's, I don't know, make cycles 10 times faster. Well, that's, that's kind of becomes more of a project. It's like, hey, let's remove like all these complexities of sliders and options and whatnot, and make cycles as easy as like you F12. You don't worry about anything. You F12, you get your beautiful image as quickly as possible. That's quite clear goal. You still might not know how exactly we'll do it, but that's okay. You have a goal. You know where you need to spend time on. Having top-level designs, again, from user-level perspective, that always helps. Like saying, okay, so that's what we want people to be able to achieve. And that will already kickstart, like, okay, so what algorithms we need to research, what areas of the Blender are touched by it, and the scoping of this project, because having a project that lasts for many months, that's always going to be a challenge of making those projects to happen. So knowing the scope, maybe you can break things down in into smaller steps and deliver things more quickly. Like it wouldn't be like this big reveal, but it will be steady pace of incremental changes, and each of the state wouldn't stress out neither developers working on this big monstrosity nor people who will see, oh, now there's this big change landing and everything is unstable, and then Trager will be like, ah. So knowing the goal is something we should pay more attention before we officially say, hey, this project started. It doesn't mean that like you cannot start thinking about what you wanted to work on. It's more like, okay, from the plannings and stuff, where do we plan having multiple people working on a project? So, I mean, okay, so we started the project, right? Okay, so, stuff happens. Okay, so it's something we talked about a lot and didn't, at least there is a feeling that nothing really actionable happened yet, is having release stages for project would help. Like similar, like, okay, so we have, in the release we have like alpha, beta, release candidate, and release. Having something similar for the projects where we say, okay, so now it's like more like, okay, some discovery phase, this is now implementation, now we focus on the bug fixing. And now we think it's in a good state, and then when we merge things to main or make it available as the experimental, well, remove experimental option behind the project, make it available for everybody. Having more clear definition for this process is something we need to spend time and find, like, okay, so what are the good dynamics, so that basically to make it so that one project becomes available for everybody, it's in a it is as in as good state as it could be. Um, the glasses.
Yeah, I saw.
Other aspects which are being quite vague in the planning of the project is exactly the stabilization period. And a lot of the times you might hear that like, okay, so maybe module can pick it up. Well, they could, but then you have 10 projects going on, and then you multiply all those stabilization and whatnot, and then all of a sudden you don't have enough people to tackle it. So the stabilization and bug fixing should be accounted as part of the project. And maybe it will prolong some projects, but on a longer term, that's going to be helpful for everybody, like within the team. So the end of the project. So when do we consider project finished? And this is something which we talk about, different ideas and whatnot. I don't think we have some like exact definition of when project ends, because it's a bit murky and whatnot, and everybody has opinions and all of them are valid, and we just need to find like, okay, so what do we consider it, and like just agree on it. So important questions are: who maintains the project after it's ended? Well, if the project is in a good enough state and doesn't add technical debt, then we can say, okay, so now modules which that project touched upon, they become the maintainers of all the changes which were done by that project. That again, like for that to be smooth transition, the technical debt on the project should not be adding more of what people already have within the module. And if that's met, I think that becomes like everybody becomes happy. Okay. So for the projects, the team is important, because we can say, hey, we want this project. Okay, so who's going to work on it? So we need to know, like, okay, so how many people going to work on it? And it's also, maybe it will be a bit, you can't say, okay, so this is one team for this one project. Team does not necessarily need to be constant throughout the project. Maybe like, some people will be, added in the middle just to help with the whatever coding, developing, testing, whatnot, and eventually it's like when it's in a stabilization process, maybe some people can go back to the module or working on a movie or whatnot. But knowing what are the resources for the project, that helps understanding, okay, so how ambitious the project can be, and what is the breakdown of the project to break it in those small incremental deliverables can be. And also it's like, okay, so because, how do I put it? So basically we want all those different and wonderful features to be implemented and whatnot, like all those projects to be kickstarted and whatnot, and usually we just look into project as like individual project, like, okay, so what is needed for this project to happen? It's like, okay, so this is what needs to happen, this people can be working on them, things like that. And then you look in another project, and then you look, okay, so that's what needs to happen. It's like, oh, great, let's have like both of them happening at the same time, and now we need to be much more careful because we only have that many developers, and for some of the discussions, I don't know, I feel like being squeaky wheel of like saying, well, if you want these two things, but it's essentially the same people working, so need to like, space them out or whatever. What else did I want to talk here about? Oh yeah, the external. Oh yeah, that's another good one, because other topic which being brought back, like, okay, so we want this project to happen, and it's like, well, we don't have people. It's like, yeah, but someone external is supposed to work on it. Well, I mean, that's great. So it's also part of the team required for the project to happen. The truth is, from Blender side, there would need to be people working together with the external contributors as well. And it could be quite involved process You cannot just rely on the fact that, well, those external people will come up with beautiful designs and you'll just will have no other choice than to accept it just because it's so beautiful. Even with there's some brilliantest people out there, they don't have that much proficiency in Blender, and you need to have some iterations on the designs. And for some of the other projects, it could be stressing designs quite behind of, quite above of what the current architecture can do, and maybe we'll also need to align few different projects so then they don't conflict with each other, things like that. So then always would need to be the investment from Blender side. And other thing to remember is it's Blender investment not only throughout the development of the project, even after when this external project is finished, from Blender team, that's technically extra work to keep carrying on, which means triaging bug reports, bug fixes, refactors. For some other cases, it could be some ongoing things like with the BPY module. It's a work which needs to be done every release, or this Microsoft App Store. I think it's called App Store. It's this thing which keeps happening every time, and then stuff does inevitably go wrong, or snap releases, or snap from their side can be changing something, and then you need to adopt, or the Steam deciding that it's a great idea to sandbox Blender. All those topics is something is up to us to solve, partially because they might be coming up quite close in the release cycle, and we need to tackle those to ensure okay, so this is a good state of Blender. We feel proud releasing Blender and not saying, well, there's something broke, it's whatever, who cares? Well, I mean, maybe nobody cares, but it doesn't feel good. And if it's something from our side, we can more easily see, okay, so please, spend time on this just because it's important. It's way harder to agree with someone working externally on priorities because they might have their own agenda and we know their direct managers and whatnot. So we cannot say, hey, please drop whatever you're doing just because we have this release stopper. Well, we can ask them, but we also need to be ready hearing no from their side. And from some of the external contributions that happens better than with, not better, but with some of the external contributors, we might rely more on them tackling all those last-minute unforeseen consequences of whatever things, and they're happy to change just because they happen to be fully dedicated to Blender. But that's not the case for all the external contributors, and who knows what the agenda of the new external people who will be adding, possibly working on different projects. Handling the feedback. Okay, so imagine main is always stable, right? It's everybody's happy to give feedback. Studio is happy giving feedback. Well, it's still quite limited, despite the fact that they're probably also the dev talk, feedback, discussion, whatever thing. People who are using Blender, they might not be so inclined to be spending hands-on time during development. There are some people who do it, and that's great, but you cannot rely on the fact that everybody who you want people to be spending more time in participating in design discussions, you cannot rely on them before release happens. And then okay, you have some feedback, you might think, well, maybe something is not important, we don't need to implement that. And then the release happens, and then everybody is forced to use what you've worked on, and then you start having the actual feedback, well, together with a lot of noise from people who just doesn't like changes. But there is a lot of valuable feedback after you release after you release Blender with new project, and at least from my perspective, it didn't feel like we had some formal process where we say, okay, so instead of scheduling whatever new project, let's say, okay, so maybe we need to have a project to stabilize what we already have. Maybe it's just some simple tweaks, but it's always all this mystical, hey, module will take care of that. so that's, I think, something we need to be spending a bit more time on, of formalizing this process. Is like, okay, so we release something, let's revisit it at some point. Exact planning and like when it happens, I don't know yet. There are different approaches to it. What will work best for dynamic, I don't know yet. Okay, well, the exciting part, the code, yay. So when it comes to the code, people are like so passionate about it, and like, yeah, I want my code to be the most beautiful thing, and like this code doesn't look that great, and it's like all legacy. Well, on a scale of Blender or any other project of that size, code is always legacy. It's just not practical, or nobody figured it out yet. Well, maybe with the chat GPT or like whatever is possible. It just with this ever-growing code base, you cannot ensure that the entirety of the code base is using the latest whatever language features or the latest whatever development. Is like, hey, what's the best design pattern for solving this problem? It's just not gonna happen. But that being said, like, okay, so if you look into the state from where we were like a couple of decades ago, we're already like much better, which is great. At least we have we attempt to have descriptive variable names, because we realize that it doesn't really help compilers to have like short variable names. It doesn't affect performance. Short variables and long variables use the same space in the registers. Yeah. So that being said, for a lot of development which happens, we tend to take shortcuts, which it's inevitable. To be practical, we need to take some shortcuts somewhere. And this becomes one of the tricky points, which, spoiler alert, will contradict with what's on one of the next slides. So the rushing and compromising on the architectural stuff is something we need to be much more conscious about. So when there is some solution to a problem and it looks super weird and dodgy, the things, well, it's a type of thing you need to think of like, okay, so what is the current architectural design we want to follow? And what are the long terms, both within not within Blender, and within like whatever whatever development. Maybe it could be like something like driver related or compiler related. Some of the examples of where some shortcuts were taken quite easily is a couple of features in cycles, which it's basically rolled back a lot of things which we try to avoid and solve during cycles X times. Basically don't have ray-intersect and shading in the same kernel. And he said, well, we need it. Has like all sorts of complications for everybody. Or the way how some of the kernel source is being modified at runtime just to gain the better number on the open data, which maybe it's something we want to have long term. I don't think so, but maybe. But in any case, the decision I think was taken quite easily. And while it's quite easy to follow, like, hey, look, we do this change, it doesn't cost us that much, and there is this metric which looks much better. You repeat this process a few times, and then you end up in spaghetti monster. One way to summarize all these things is like, okay, shortcut does not reduce the size of critical path. It's like, okay, so you saved somewhere else, but then it means like somewhere later on you will need to spend time on dealing with the consequences of a shortcut. So overall, on the grand scheme of time, it didn't contribute anything. That being said, so we have this legacy code, right? And code is always legacy. It's just inevitable. And for developers, it becomes quite tempting to say, okay, so if you're touching this code, let's make it as beautiful as possible or as modern as possible. Well, for some stuff, for some changes, it might be good. If this approach, however, have like these consequences of being able to pull bigger architectural changes in a reasonable amount of time, because if we say, okay, so we do while we are changing this architecture, okay, so we need to modify a lot of codes, and then we submit PRs, and then there might be like a lot of discussions like, oh, but like now that's what we need to use here, and that's what we need to use there, and then we spend weeks on just one PR, and then we realize, well, that was just like 1% of a project, and then you spend like a week on hopefully reviewing and landing it. So when it comes to dealing with some bigger architectural changes, you need to take steps as small as possible. Like meaning it's like, okay, so that's the architecture we want to go into. Okay, so there's a change which moves us closer. The code which doesn't look ideal, that's already was before all those architectural changes in main branch. There is no need to change that code because it was there, it didn't really cause issues. It's not necessarily going to be a stopper for some architectural changes. Maybe it is, but often it doesn't. So basically just focus, okay, so we want to change this architecture, but we don't modify algorithms or like whatever other thing without no reason. And examples of these approaches could be the compositors, where it's a bit further stretched example, because with GPU compositor we had to modify a lot of algorithms just because existing ones were not compatible with GPU. If you look into tiled or full frame compositor, it's like, okay, a lot of changes for the how you schedule things. The algorithm of specific nodes did not change, and some of them were like, well, I don't understand what's even going on there. Or other example is cycles X, where in one like whatever summer or whatever, we basically changed the entire architecture of cycles from being mega kernel to split to wavefront render. It's a huge amount of architectural changes. The algorithms themselves, we modified some of them just because we had time and we knew that we have time and we had proper time boxing. A lot of things did not change on algorithmically. It just were no reason to change those just because they worked. They might not look as pretty as they could, but hey, we need to, deliver the rest of the project. And then, within 6 months, we were talking about, okay, so we basically rewrote this architecture and brought 10x performance on a GPU for people, which, 10x, so amount of access per unit month was quite cool. Anyway, so moving on. So the comments, okay, so the scope is the communication. So there are a couple of places where comments are super useful in the code, and they kind of like have different approaches to them. One of them is the IPI. So when you work on a module, for something that you expect, hey, this is publicly available IPI for others to use from our module. Well, the function calls, their parameters should be clear enough. Function should be clearly documented, okay, what it is doing, what the preconditioners it expects. Maybe it expects like, okay, so maybe, blend file needs to be already merged into single B main, or maybe the B main should still be split into libraries or whatnot. Putting those in the documentation of the function at the comment. That will help again, like future you, your colleagues, new people dropping by. Other aspect is the examples of using some IPIs. Okay, so how do you have this tricky whatever parallel reduction function? Okay, so how do you use it in practice, because it might not be so clear from the parameters? Having some simple snippet of the code saying, okay, so that's how you, I don't know, do Fibonacci or some other thing. That helps explaining, okay, so how to use this API properly. Now, other aspect is the readability of the code itself, or what you can call like local readability. And in a lot of projects, including Blender in the past, there was this statement that code should be self-documenting and that it should be clear like what's going on in the code. Well, my statement is if it's unclear what happens in the code, this code should not exist. But then it's also, okay, so from the code side, you can see what is going on, but that's not the question you're asking while reading the code. You're asking why, like why this thing is done the way it is done, and that's something like you cannot put in the codes. And other thing which helped a lot in cycles and in the compositor, and I believe can be used in many other places, well, also in the motion tracking, refer to papers which you implement and even refer to equations, because there might be some tricky whatever math expression. It's like, okay, where is this coming from? Well, it's equation 55, I don't know, from whatever paper. That helps a lot for understanding what's going on, and also it helps others people to spot the bug, because it's not uncommon that people make a typo while putting formula from the white paper to a code. So all this referring to things helps. And other aspect of local readability, which I forgot to mention here, is when you read pull request or a diff, you have very limited scope. And if you can understand what's going on from just reading that diff, you can say, okay, it's good, like accept green, done. If it's not so clear, then you will be spending time on figuring out, okay, so what's going on, expanding the context, whatnot, and what this TMP2 or TMP1 difference is, and why it's in they're written in the orders they're written, and what this RT is about. I don't know. You'll need to reverse engineer the code for that, and so it takes everyone's time. So I put tests in the section of the code. I don't know how fair it is, but it is what it is. So basically, the test coverage in some areas is not too bad. In others, it's non-existing, and there is like this kind of chicken and egg problem, saying, hey, like only if we had like whatever automated coverage calculation and visualization and whatnot, then we maybe be motivated to whatever cover more things. I mean, not unfair point. Having some visualization is fun. If you talk to people like who came through this process, the reply would be, it's like, well, it's fun, but it's not something that is really drives towards having code better tested. Another aspect is like, okay, so you're working on some project or whatever refactor, you need to have something locally. You cannot rely on the fact that, hey, like I made this test, I committed and whatnot, see the coverage. Well, okay, you can do that. You make a test, you submit, you wait for the thing to appear in the code coverage, and meanwhile you wait. Or behind other doors, you can either like use like carefully calibrated eagle eye to see what type of input data you need to give to regression test. Or you can simply just add the board statements. If you see, hey, this code I don't fully understand, there are like all the if branches and whatnot, well, add the boards and keep adding test cases until your application doesn't crash. Then like, well, now like all the major parts at least covered. So, and that's something you can do locally, like quite easily, without need to create PR to just do the adding tests and like waiting for whatever automated thing to kick in. So there is that. When you change some code, make sure that it's covered with tests. That's nobody will ever say no to tests. Everybody loves using tests. It's just nobody likes to work on them. So the thing is that's investment in the future again. So it's future you will benefit from it next time you'll be touching this code. It will help reviewer saying, okay, so it seems like all the major cases are covered. So yeah, just land it. If we miss something, we extend this test and move on with life. And then also run the test before you land changes. Hopefully with the bigger change in the entire process of going PR-only workflow, maybe it will be less of a problem. But in a lot of cases, code is being landed and it doesn't compile on some platforms or tests are not passing. So don't forget about actually using regression tests. One thing to note is that we are aware of the time it takes to run tests. We're working on solutions for that, both for the Billbot and locally. So hopefully it will be much more inviting to run the test, even though, like, for myself, I never found it a huge stopping factor. Okay, so what are the good tests? Well, the test should be easy to add and maintain. If the entry bar for adding a test is so high, well, nobody will be adding it, so that's not good. If the test is a burden to maintain, well, eventually it will be removed just because it's such a burden and doesn't help long term. What is proven working very, very well is the visual representation of tests, similar to what we do in cycles, where we just render a lot of images, and when the test fails, okay, you have your actual image, your reference image, the difference, and whatever. And then it's easy to see, hey, is this breakage in the test something we anticipated? Because sometimes you do need to modify some algorithm, and it will lead to different result. And if it's visual, you can see, okay, so there's nothing wrong. It's actually anticipated. There were cases where some of the mesh modifiers tests just used checksums on whatever coordinates and other topology elements. And then people said, well, we modified array modifier and whatnot, and we expect hash to be changed. And they just accepted hash, and yeah, there was actual bug. So more visual, more easy it is to spot the errors, more easy it is to update whatever is needed. Other aspect is tests should be fast to run locally. One of them is when I work on a test, I always disable this single binary because you work on something quite technical. There's some formula. You just add the test. You save the test file. If you don't disable that option, CMake will rerun this discovery of tests, reeling the entirety of the tests, and be like, dude, it's just one cheap-poo file. It's like, why do I need like the rest of the Blender? So that's something when you work on a new stuff and wanted to cover with tests. That's something to keep in mind, that there are ways to make certain things more efficient. And I kind of stress it more. Developers need to trust tests. Like if there is test is failing at random, remove the test. It doesn't add value to overall in the team. If you know that something is under certain conditions is failing, well, that's knowledge you have. That's not the knowledge you can transfer to everybody else. And it's also okay, so someone creates PR, test failing, okay, now they need to go and spend time, hey, is it expected or is it not expected? It takes a lot of time. So people need to trust tests, and then it becomes like this smooth process of, ensuring that there are no regressions and the regression don't sneak through, and that the test, the ability delivered and whatnot, like all sorts of things. Speaking of tests, the testing framework. In Blender, there are some testing frameworks which literally consist of thousands of lines of code with no tests for the testing framework. It's like, okay, so do you trust this testing framework? How do you know that that testing framework actually does what it's supposed to be doing? That's one aspect of it. Other aspect of it is like those testing frameworks just happen to be quite horrible to use by others. It might be solving some specific case of like, okay, so that's specific things we are testing about, testing against. There is this entire testing framework. It's like, okay, so there is similar looking thing. Let's try to use it. And then you spend a few days and you realize it's not usable for that specific case. or that you don't really understand. So this is why when new framework or whatever is added or current ones are revisited, it needs to be clear. Well, there's developer working on that framework, so that someone who works on that framework needs to focus. Okay, so how would others work with my framework? Is it clear enough? Is it easy enough? Because if it's not easy enough, nobody will be adding tests. Like it should be the leastest possible entry point, bar, whatever, for people to be able to add and maintain tests. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. So other aspect is the way how we deal with branches and pull requests. So again, like Blender is a team project, right? So having clear presentation and representation of the state of things you're working on is important. It's quite often where you might see, hey, there is this PR, what you think? It's like, well, it's marked as work in progress. Git put this the description to no response. It's like, give me some background, like all those things we talked about for the whatever design. Give me the scope, like what it is all about, what are you trying to solve. Because otherwise it's just people who you're asking for whatever review or even original opinions about something, they'll spend a lot of time trying to just catch up, like what's going on there. And another aspect is like sometimes you see like all these big projects landing to main, and then you wonder, hey, but was it reviewed even? Because it caused all sorts of issues. What's happened there? And like sometimes it's like, okay, it didn't happen, which like we'll need to talk about it. But sometimes the review did happen, it just happened somewhere else. Like similarly to light linking, we worked on a branch for a while. We had whatever task for the light linking, and you can see, okay, so individual commits, PRs, all of them reference to that parent task, and you can say, well, this is. Well, from the main branch perspective, you say, hey, this is light linking landing here. There is design tag. There is like whatever review happened there. Doesn't need to be anything fancy, but it does help communication within the team to see, hey, this is actually doesn't come out of the blue. So, the thing which some people were like here gathered here, it's like, okay. What?
This is the main topic.
Yes, that's what people wanted to know about.
I think people who are remote, they don't see the rest of the room, and they may only hear Sergey. But there was a huge wave of, oh, is it finally starting? You've been talking for an hour and such.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. He knows how to hold the mic, right? Huh?
So there will be episode 2. That's what you mean?
No. That's not what I mean. But how much more do you have to say?
Few slides.
Yeah. Because this is what I really want to finish on. So it is now.
Yes.
It is the good time. Do you want to drink something?
No, fine.
You good? Okay.
I'm sure. Okay, so there is all those quality November, quality December, January, what is this about? It's like we're all confused. What are we supposed to be working on? Well, the easy executive explanation: improve the product.
Now I get it.
See? Yes. So the important thing is the current state of the product. It's not like, hey, let's open the doors for another new sexy whatever things. We have family show, cannot be saying that. So that being said, sometimes adding small feature is actually addressing the quality of the current product, because sometimes we sacrificed some things just to be able to release certain projects, things like that. So it's not like, hey, no new features at all. It's more like, okay, what we have, make it so that within those realms, people are happy using Blender. So that's big scope. Okay, what can it be consisting of? Well, focus on the bug reports. And remember that there are bug reports which are not high severity, because we have more than 50 whatever bugs. We probably have 6,000 or something. Focus on those, because some of them might not be severe enough for being able to drop everything you do now and fix them, but there is a lot of bugs solving which will help a lot of people. Other aspect is solve accumulated technical debt. So, historical reasons, technical debt comes up and down, and currently it feels it's a bit down. So focus on solving that technical debt which you think exists in your module. The documentation. There's a lot of documentation to be written, and improve testing in the module. We will never say, hey, don't add tests. The more tests we have, the more we can prevent certain regressions happening again is better. So from the examples, from something like, just something I know it might be spending time on for the documentation, like the multi-res propagation algorithm. It's this tricky part. There are some comments in the code, but overall it's not that clear what's going on there. Some pictures will help. Light trees algorithm. It's based on white papers, but then we had to modify them to be usable for production render. Sharing this information would be great. When it comes to the quality in the code, split the manifold next event estimation into own kernel, bring back us to architecture where we don't have shading, surface shading, and reintersect in the same kernel. Or like the hash function in cycles. Like recently someone brought up that we have 11 of them. And it's like, why do we need so many? And make it so that the code is ready for the upcoming projects. Like one of the examples could be the online asset something. I forgot the exact name of the project. Online asset libraries. So basically, it's like in a way it could be seen as natural extension of extensions platform, but reality is that the code, some parts of the code which basically define like all those communication APIs between Blender and the server, they're not done in a way how you would do it in 2024. And being the first whatever thing saying, okay, so that's how we expect Blender to communicate to the internet. Well, we need to make sure that that kind of becomes handbook example how we want it to be happening. Other topics could be polishing the rough corners of whatever project which already landed in 4.2, 4.3. Like there's plenty of feedback to go about. It doesn't need to be like it's not something like major like rewrites and stuff, but it's quality of life improvements which people bring up in all sorts of different reports and outside of the bug reports. Can focus on the bug reports, see like the status of the module, bring the workboards up to the good state. For the test, like if it was up to me, I would focus on the GPU test and the Hydra and Storm test, because those are the ones which constantly failing. And this is also why we're a bit procrastinating in enabling GPU tests by default. So in the longer term, ideally we will not do Blender winter of quality, whatever, because all the things which currently happening is more like, okay, so we have quite legacy code base. There are some projects which happened in the way we don't want them to be happening again. So it's more about like tackling all those legacies and technical depths. Ideally, all the things which you're tackling now, that should be spread over the working as part of a project. And maybe we also will say, okay, so we need to have space for boring project. It's not like, hey, there is a new exciting feature. It's more like we're polishing what we already have. There is like all this amount of feedback, and we need to incorporate to it, and maybe it even needs to be done by multiple people.
Stability is exciting.
Well,
He said it.
yeah, he said it.
Tell everyone.
What?
I'm
What?
convinced of it.
Boring project stability, quality is exciting.
Well, boring from the executive's perspective. It's in a
Yeah, but then sell it.
Well, the thing is, so okay, so imagine the picture. So there's this unstable blender, and Simon is trying to texture paint and bake something, and then he presses the button, and blender crashes. He loses whatever number of hours of work, and then he's all sad and depressed. That's average day at Blender Studio. Now imagine you fix that bug, and then Simon can do all those things, press the bake button, and not only it doesn't crash, the bake happens just as quickly as possible, and everything is just like beautiful. And then at the end of the day, Simon is happily presenting whatever he was working on.
Unicorns and kittens.
Yes. I don't know. Is that convincing enough?
Simon?
He's sick.
He's stuck baking.
So, and for some other things, it's some of those topics which being tackled now, it should become more natural thing to tackle by the module, just because it will be smaller scope of things brought to the module. Yeah. Only whatever 30 minutes later.
Okay. Let's.
Winter is coming.
Yes, winter is coming. That's the whole point. How many people are still here? Whoa! Nice. Omar, Thomas, Philip, Christoph. We don't have anyone from the. No, you couldn't. We don't have anyone from
have the stage.
the Americas. Or do we? No, don't think so. Yeah, well, thank you everyone for joining. I think we can let it sink in. Get questions to Sergey and I through the chat. Don't hesitate. I'll be sharing the video on our YouTube as usual. We'll be sharing the PDF of the presentation also with the bullet points. We'll be communicating on DevTalk again about this winter of quality, as you are naming it, so that it's clearer for everyone and contributors. And this video might also be shared for the world to see. We'll have to check again if you said anything that should be kept internal. Editing can come in at some point.
It's nothing internal, but it's PG, whatever.
No, but it's okay. But I think it would be very useful for people from the community who contribute, and also people who just want to know what we do as developers and development people. Might generate a lot of views. And as you can all see, he could do a career in podcasts. Thank you, Sergey.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining again. And please let us know if you have any questions via the chat. Yay! Your career is on. Bye-bye.
Love.